Hey everybody, it's Vanessa, the Crafty Gemini, and welcome to episode number 82 of WIP Wednesday. Today I'm going to be answering some pre-submitted questions. If you're not familiar with the format of how we do these live shows, there is a form and we've linked to it in the caption of this video and in the video description box. If you're catching us on YouTube, you can use that link to submit any questions that you'd like for me to consider answering in a future episode, okay? So let's just make sure that y'all can see me and hear me. Hey, Chris, tuning in from Palm Coast. I see Lee is in the house from Boston. Hi, Margie. Miss Monique is on. Wendy from Hawaii. Aloha, she says. And okay, good. So far, it looks like y'all can see me and hear me. So we're coming to you here from my home crafting studio. We live in North Central Florida, where everything is blooming, and I doubt it's going to freeze anymore, so I'm going to rush and get my plants in the garden, hopefully over this weekend and the next week. Awesome. Okay. Good, so let's go ahead and get started. The first question that I have here has to do with stitch length and width, and the question comes from Francis. So Francis is asking, is this only applicable for zigzag sewing? She's talking about stitch length. She says, I can understand stitch width is for straight stitch. So I think in typing up the question, she may have gotten them mixed up because it's actually the opposite. Let's go ahead and switch them. Great. So stitch length is what you can change up and is affected if you're adjusting your settings on your sewing machine when you are working with a straight stitch, okay? So a straight stitch we know is just the needle goes in and out and in and out in a straight line. And so what we can adjust on our sewing machine most of the time, some of the more vintage machines may not have that option, but I have a machine from 1938 and I can still adjust the stitch length, so I think you're pretty good there. Prior to zigzag sewing machines though, you weren't really going to have that option of stitch width. I guess it would still apply because some of the vintage machines I have still allow me to scoot the needle over for, like, you're adjusting the width, but because there's no actual zigzag going on, you're just moving the needle position. And I'll show y'all a visual on my sewing machine in a minute. But stitch length has to do with how long the distance is between each time that the needle goes in and in again into the fabric, okay? So the shorter the stitch length, the tighter the stitch, the harder it's going to be to rip that seam, the harder it's also going to be for you to take your seam ripper and pull out that seam. Okay, the more it's going to hold the fabrics together, all those things, because it's shorter, tighter, and also it's going to be stiffer because you're getting more thread in a shorter space there, okay? Now, the longer the stitch length, the more loose that seam is going to be because there is more space in between the stitches. And so I'll show y'all a close-up here. I did 3 lines of stitching earlier so you could see. This is the longest one, and this is a 5mm setting, I believe, on my sewing machine, and it's the longest that it can go. Some machines will go up to 6mm in length, others will go up to 7 or even longer, okay? So my little machine, the Juki LB5020 that a lot of you have purchased from us, goes up to 5mm stitch length, and look what happens. Because there's so much space in between where the needle goes in and out of the fabric, okay? This is a weaker seam. You run the risk of jewelry, earrings, toenails, fingers getting caught, okay, underneath here and snagging any seams that you have or stitching that you have exposed, say top stitching or something like that. The one next to it here is a shorter stitch length, and you can see that I can't really get the tip of this. There we go. So it took a little bit more work, and I can't quite get the stitch too far up of my bamboo knitting needle here because the stitch is shorter. So this was 3mm stitch length. So 5mm, way loose, and really if I pulled on this, look what happens. It pulls out the whole thing. So this is what we would call a basting stitch. If you were doing something like this, like a long straight stitch, usually we do it in garment sewing or even in bag making where you're just wanting some temporary hold of things that you're positioning in place. So this is a great way to audition something if you're not ready to kind of commit to a short and tight stitch length when you're playing around constructing something, okay? So if you did a longer stitch length, it would be easy for you to audition it and then pull it all out. So see what happens? This is why it's called a basting stitch, because we use it for a temporary hold and I can pull all the bobbin thread out, and that was super easy. I didn't really even have to cut or break into the thread. I could just pull it out of the seam. So that's what you can do with a longer stitch length. And so of course, if you are, making yourself a dress, you're not gonna want a long straight stitch like that on the sides of your dress because any wear and tear or tug on that, it can rip it open, okay? So think about how you can adjust the stitch length to make it work for your specific application, right? Like I just mentioned, if you're auditioning something, do a long stitch, test it out, try it on, see if it works. And if you like it where it's at, then you go in with a shorter, tighter stitch length to secure that connection, okay? This next one here I talked about was 3mm stitch length. And I could probably still pull this. You see if I tug on it real hard, but it does take more work and I have to pull stitches that are closer together because there's more in and out of the needle, see? Like that, okay? So you're not really gonna easily be able to pull this one, see? Like really, really hard. I can't just pull it like we did with the longer one, okay? With the seam that we sewed with a longer stitch length. So this is 3mm. Now this one here, straight up impossible. There's no way. I mean, I can not even, let me see. I wonder if y'all can even see that. It just look, you see, it doesn't even want to focus. You cannot even make out the stitch. It just looks like in and out of every single little bit of stitching there, and there's no way that this is going to go anywhere. I can't even grab it with like, yeah, they're super tiny. And I think I did this, I don't know what the shortest thing was, maybe like 0.5 or something on here. It must have been a 1mm stitch length, okay? So super duper duper tight. So again, think about having this stitch in an application where you're auditioning something. Don't use this because you're not going to be able to take it out easily, okay? It's going to be a lot more work. So the other thing is that if you have a stitch this tight and this short, you know that that seam is not going anywhere. I mean, you could put a lot of weight, whether this is a bottom seam of a tote bag or something, you could put a lot of weight there. It's not going to rip, okay? Especially if you use, say like I'm using here, an all-purpose polyester thread. Synthetic threads are stronger than the natural fibers like cotton, so they're going to add even, you know, kind of another layer of strength to your seams. So hopefully that's showing you the visual of 1mm stitch length, 3mm stitch length, and the 5mm stitch length that's not even there anymore will help you kind of understand a little bit more how stitch length works. Now that is for straight stitches, okay? Let's go in and do some zigzag stitches on my sewing machine here. I want y'all to make sure you can see the settings as I play with them and adjust them here, okay? So now, let's just fold this up. If I select a zigzag stitch on my machine here, for me, it's stitch number 7, okay? You can't really see it, but it's here. I have a little list of decorative stitches. So stitch number 7, so I'm gonna go here and select 7, 07, that's the stitch selection. Now, you saw that these numbers were changing here. That's stitch width and stitch length. So usually if you have a computerized sewing machine that allows you to change up stitch length, stitch width, needle position, and all that, they usually have these little icons on here to let you know which one you've selected, and if you go up and down from there, which one you're changing, right? Because if you go up or down on your stitch width, that's not going to affect the length. So you got to know what you're trying to change up between those two settings, okay? So here, right here, can you see that little ziggy-zag right above the 5.0? That's width. And the graphic usually looks like a narrow zigzag and then it gets wider and wider and bigger. So it's telling you that is where you would adjust it to make that zig and zag, that insertion point, and where it comes out every time the needle goes into your project, how wide is the distance between them, okay? That's width. The next one just has a dashed line, and again, it goes from little, so you see like a little dashed line, then it gets a little longer, and then a little longer, telling you, hey, these numbers here, you would adjust this to make that little dash of your stitch longer. Remember, the distance between every time the needle goes in and in the project again. The shorter that distance is, the tighter the stitch is going to be, the harder it's going to be to remove. The bigger the distance between every time, between every time the needle goes in your project, the longer the stitch is going to be, the weaker the seam, the easier for it to come out. So try to practice that even if you're just playing around on your sewing machine and stitch it out. When you see what happens when you adjust the settings up or down, it really helps you to kind of practice that and then remember it for future projects, okay? Oh, you're welcome. Marilyn says, thanks so much on showing me the basics. I'm happy to help. These are all the little things that, you can figure it out by using your user manual, but the best way is to make projects. And y'all know I have over 700 free video tutorials on my YouTube channel, and we have a ton of different classes, almost 100 digital courses that you can sign up for, where I go more into depth, making a variety of projects, okay? But yeah, turn on your machine, grab some scrap fabrics, and then play around with these settings like I'm doing here. Okay, so if we have it set to the zigzag stitch, these are the default settings. Whoops, popped off this. These are the default settings on my machine. So it's going to default to stitching out a zigzag that's 5 millimeters in width, meaning the zig and the zag, okay? And then 1.5 millimeters in length. We already know, right, from the straight stitches that we just did, that a stitch length of 1.0 was that super, super short, tight one. So 1.5 in length, you know it's not going to be too spaced out, okay? But how does that affect the zig and the zag of the stitch? Well, let's stitch it out and see what we get. And I have a purple thread here, so this should show up good for you on this yellow fabric. Okay. So I'm just going to let it stitch. I'm not fighting the fabric. I'm letting it pull it through. And this is how you know that those settings are actually what the machine is stitching. If you yank on your fabric and you're holding on to it and the machine can't pull it through, this stuff here is not going to matter because you are distorting what the machine is set to do. So if you want the true settings that you've selected, make sure that you don't tug on the machine and let it pull the fabric so you get the correct spacing. Okay, so now let's have a look. 5 millimeter, remember, was the default stitch setting for the width. That means the zig and the zag is 5 millimeters apart. That's why you see it's kind of like a good, it's pretty wide zigzag. So you got to be careful too on your machine to know what the default setting is. I have other machines where the default here for a zigzag is maybe 3.0 and 2. So it's going to be narrower and close and a little bit more spaced out versus this one. So it's always important to test out the decorative stitches on your machine so you can see like, oh no, the zigzag is too big for this project or it's too small. And it's important to know how to manipulate the settings, so you can get the most out of your sewing machine because it does have these options. So 5 millimeters, zig and zag, where it goes in at the left in the project, where it goes in at the right, that distance is 5 millimeters, okay? And then the spacing between them is 1.5 millimeters, which is not much. That's why you see it's kind of a more squished together zigzag. All right, well, let's change up the settings so we can see what the difference is going to be by adjusting these settings here. And I'm going to do it right next to this one so you can visually see the difference, okay? All right, so we're going to go into the project. I can just sink the needle down. Let me change these settings now. So 5 millimeter was the stitch width. Say I want to go narrower. I'm stitching something, a kind of like a fine edge around something where I want the zigzag not to span that wide, just a little bit tighter. Let's go to 3 millimeters. So we went down from 5 millimeter in stitch width, remember, wide. That means side to side, okay? And then I dropped it to 3 millimeters. Then let's space this out. If instead of 1.5 millimeters, which is kind of, that's what I mentioned, the squished together zigzag stitches, let's space them out, okay? Let's go up to 4. So we've kind of gone opposite on the default settings, and it's going to make a huge difference in what the zigzag that the machine is going to stitch out looks like. So let's see. Look how much faster it jumps through, and that has to do with the stitch length. The stitch length is as the distance between you and the fabric as it's pulling through the machine. So vertically this way, okay? Stitch width is side to side. So now look at this. So when you hear of a zigzag stitch, you can't just choose any old zigzag stitch and think that it's going to work in a project, okay? Unless it's like a decorative stitch and it doesn't matter what it is and they tell you, hey, just do whatever cute stitch you like around this edge or something. But if I was going to sew something together that needed a zigzag stitch, this is not it right here. This is so spaced out that it's going to be a weaker seam than this one, right? It's also going to be more lightweight. So you may call for it, it may call for something like this in specific instances where you don't want to have that added thread buildup. Because look at the difference between how much thread it took to go from here to here than from here to here, right? So this is like super important for you to grab scrap fabrics and play around with the decorative stitches on your machine because you got to know what they look like and how you can manipulate it to get the stitch you need. A lot of times students get frustrated with patterns and like they told me to use a zigzag stitch, I used it, it fell apart, whatever it is. You have to think about, we're not selecting stitches when we have these machines that have a ton of different stitches to pick from. We're not selecting one just based on looks. A lot of these times, the stitch that we select has to do with function in the project as well. So this is why I like to teach the why we're doing things. You know, if you follow me in my courses or in my tutorials, I tell you, hey, we're going to do a narrow zigzag because we're working with stretch fabrics and we want it to stretch without the stitches popping, right? So I'm telling you why we're doing these things. And so, you know, as a teacher, I like to show the visual and get you to kind of understand why we do the things we do. It's not just because I like the look of this one better, right? So keep that kind of stuff in mind. So you saw how I changed the settings and I got a totally different look, okay? And imagine all the different distances and measurements in between. I could get a huge variety of different types of zigzag stitches off the same machine just by adjusting the length settings and the width settings, okay? So to answer Francis's question, is the stitch length only applicable for zigzag sewing? I think we covered that already, that the stitch length has to do more with the straight stitch. And when we throw in width, this is where we're adjusting width this way and the length in between the zigzag. It doesn't have to be a zigzag, but you know, there's other decorative stitches that have a similar jump from side to side. So on here, you'll have two settings to adjust, okay? Stitch length and width. And then on the straight stitch one, you're really just adjusting how long you want that straight stitch to be. But let me show you what happens if you adjust stitch width on a straight stitch, right? We've already established that width applies to the zig and the zag, the jumping from side to side. We said width goes side to side on the stitch, okay? But if we're doing a straight stitch that doesn't jump from side to side, instead it just stitches straight, if I change the stitch width, and you're not going to be able to see it too easily. Let me tip this back because it happens as I mess with the settings, okay? So let me try to get something darker behind here. It's not much for y'all to see, but I do want you to kind of understand what it is that we're doing. Okay, so let me put this here. Okay, much better. So that we're blocking out a lot of stuff. So you can see my needle there, okay? Just keep your eye on the needle. So let me go to a straight stitch. On this machine, it is stitch 0, 0, okay? 3.5 it says for stitch width. And you might be wondering, why does it say the width is 3.5 when we know it's not going to jump side to side? Well, the width setting on a straight stitch corresponds to the needle position of the machine. So at 3.5, when I look at it on my presser foot, I know that that's the center needle position on my machine. So I can go up from there and it's going to scoot the needle over one way. But if I go down from this setting, it's going to scoot the needle the opposite way. So think about how you can use that in a huge variety of projects. You're top stitching a zipper and you want to get close to the edge without the bulkiness of the zipper foot or of your presser foot here getting in the way. You can move that needle all the way over. Say a project calls for 1/8 of an inch seam allowance and you don't have 1/8 of an inch seam allowance foot. You have your universal foot and you want to figure out, well, how can I get that needle to be just 1/8 of an inch away from the edge? You can move the needle position. Simple, okay? So let's go hover under here under stitch width. And now I want you to keep your eye on this needle as I change these settings, okay? So I'm going to go down to 0 from 3.5. Watch the needle. It scooted it all those places over to the left, okay? Now let's go up and watch the needle again. So now, remember when we did the stitch width on the zigzag, we could only go up to 5 millimeters. Well, because we're not actually stitching there, this allows me to go to 7 millimeters as far as the positioning of the needle. So now if we think 0 to 7, half of 7 is what? 3.5. And that's what we had as the default setting, right? As the center needle position. So that's how we work that out, okay? So 0 is going to put my needle all the way to the left. 7 in this setting is going to move it all the way to the right. And 3.5 puts it smack dab in the middle. Now, if you've been watching me use this machine over the past couple of years on my WIP Wednesday episodes and in a lot of my video courses, I use this machine to show students, you know, you can make this project on a home sewing machine like this one that we sell in the shop. You'll see me sew 1/4 of an inch seams, and I sew a scant 1/4 of an inch seam, and I will move that needle position to 5 millimeters. So instead of being in the middle, I've scooted it a little to the right. So now I can follow the edge of my foot and I'm going to get a perfect 1/4 of an inch seam without having to change out the foot, okay? So understanding how these settings affect what you want to achieve, the positioning of your needle, the length of the stitch, how difficult it's going to be for that seam to come or for the seam to rip out. These are all things that you can see with just a couple of buttons. you can adjust it to make it work for what you want. Okay, so stitch length and width doesn't just apply to a zigzag or a straight stitch. You can do things by adjusting both of those depending on the scenario. All right, so hopefully that helps y'all. Lynette says, listen to her, y'all. I had my machine since 2016 and didn't realize that I could move my needle over until I saw a video of Vanessa's about a month ago. Wow. Well, I'm so glad you saw it. Now you know. Now you know, Lynette. Now you know. That's awesome. Great. Yay. And Tracy says, thanks for explaining this fully. It helps me so much. Well, I'm glad to help. Good. I see some of y'all here are, you're experienced sewists and quilters. So I'm glad that this is also, making it make a little bit more sense for y'all too. Okay? So that's how that works. Again, when I used to teach classes more in person, I would have students come with like a white fabric or a pale colored fabric. We'd fold it in half because notice, when I was stitching these samples out, I'm stitching them still through 2 layers. If you're trying to test out decorative stitches or you want to see how, what the stitch is going to actually look like in a finished project, the best way to test it is through 2 layers. It's not going to be like a true representation of the final stitch in a project if you just do it through 1 thin layer, because we never really sew through just 1 thin layer, right? Unless we're gathering something or we're basting or marking something. If you want to see how it's going to look in your project, make sure that you fold it or put another layer. You want to be testing and auditioning things through 2 layers, which is, 99% of the time what you're going to be sewing through, okay? So I would have them just fold the fabric like that and go through their machines. If you have 300 decorative stitches on your machine, get a couple different pieces of fabric, fold it in half, like a bigger chunk, so you can do a longer repetition of the stitch. And I call it like a little stitch Bible. And you can just go through with a Sharpie, write the number. And that way, because look, when you look at these decorative stitches on a machine, yes, it looks cute. Yes, it's supposedly telling you what the design is. But I'm going to tell you right now, they rarely look like what they do on here than they do stitched out. So sometimes you might look at this and think, I don't really care for those stitches. And then when you stitch it out, you're like, oh, actually, that's super cute. I'd like to do that in this whatever project, okay? So stitch them out so you can see what it looks like and play around with the stitch width and the stitch length on these, and you can kind of distort them a little bit, make them wider, make them longer, till you find a look that you like. So for those of you that don't have machines that have like hundreds and hundreds of decorative stitches, you've already seen just by adjusting a couple of these settings, I got 2 totally different zigzag stitches. So if you have just a few different designs that you could stitch out on your more basic machine like mine, try it out. You could still, call them decorative stitches and use them in certain instances where, a fancier machine would have more options, but you still have some, okay? Great. All right. Yes, Chris says, I always test my stitch before sewing on my project. Super, super important. All right. Oh, great call by Sherry. She says, just be sure when moving that needle one way or the other to have the right foot on so it clears the presser foot. So this is one thing, and you'll hear me say it whenever we're sewing zippers on. I'll say, make sure you put that needle to the default position again. Because sometimes if you have the needle, say, scooted all the way over and you install a zipper foot, the zipper foot is not designed to stitch with that needle moved over. So when you take that first stitch, it's going to hit the metal of the presser foot and you'll break the needle. But it only takes once or twice of that happening for you to be like, oh yeah. You can just, if you don't remember the default setting on your machine, just turn the machine on and off again if it's a computerized one, and it will reset itself to the default setting, and then you'll be in the clear from there, okay? All right. Zena's asking a quick question here. She says, maybe a dumb question. So decorative stitches are only for decorations? Not necessarily, because I mean, a zigzag stitch could be considered a decorative stitch if you used it as that, but you can also use a zigzag stitch for more construction-like purposes. So it just depends. Top stitching, I often do straight stitch for top stitching, even though I also use straight stitching for construction seams. So it just depends. They can kind of go back and forth, but like a really fancy swirly stitch, you're not going to use that for construction because it's not going to be straight and consistent. You'll get a seam that bows out in and out. So yes, the fancier, more decorative ones are for decorative top stitching. You can do it, along an edge of something. Some of them are designed to go on kind of like machine embroidery almost, where you use a stabilizer on the back, like a tearaway or a water-soluble stabilizer. You stitch through it and then you remove it from the back. But, most of the ones on here that I'm talking about, like for simple stuff, are going to be either like a fake serger or overlock stitch, which is not a decorative stitch. It's also for function, to finish off the seams and keep them from fraying further on the inside. But the flourishy ones, yes, those are more for decorative stitches. Okay. All right, so next one. I have a question here from Trelisa. So she's asking, do you ever suggest cutting a lining fabric a little shorter than the outer fabric for our bag projects? I often feel like my lining is too big. We get this all the time, y'all. And if you know me and in my classes, you'll see what I talk about. I just pulled out a little zip pouch that we're going to be making in my foundation paper piecing club. And this is a quick and easy example. If you have a look inside a pouch like this, can you see how nice that lining sits in there? There's no wrinkling, there's no bubbling, there's no excess of fabric. It's like when I open it, I can see all the way to the bottom and all the way to the corners, okay? So this is what I'm teaching my students how to make with our little foundation paper piece blocks in my quilt club. If you missed out on it, the doors are already closed, but you can check it out on our website and add yourself to the wait list. So when we open the club back up, you'll learn how to make these different blocks. And instead of making a huge quilt with this time-intensive technique of foundation paper piecing, we're gonna make them into zipper pouches. So here's another example. And I know some of you that maybe have made tons of pouches in the past are thinking, how in the world? I want my linings to look like that. Well, it doesn't have to do with cutting the lining smaller like Trelisa is suggesting in her question here. Instead, we cut the lining to the same size or, whatever the pattern tells you to do. In my case, say for this, we are cutting it to the same size as the exterior panels. But the difference is in eating up more of that lining fabric in the side seam allowances. And I have multiple videos on this on my YouTube channel. If you type go to youtube.com and type in CraftyGemini bag lining, all the videos where I'm talking about this are going to come up. And I show you an example. I kind of sew up two linings and I show you the difference. Because you got to think, the lining is going inside of the project, okay? The exterior fabric is outside, so it's kind of round out like a bag that you can fill with stuff. Well, if we're putting the same amount of fabric inside, it has to pool inside if it's the same size as the outside because the outside is keeping it from kind of spreading itself fully out. So we need to take up some of that excess fabric in the seam allowance. Now, the reason I do not cut the bag linings shorter, in other words, you have your exterior panel, you're cutting the matching lining pieces. I don't start off with a smaller piece, is because it won't reach the side seams then. If your linings are smaller to begin with, you're not going to be able to reach the sides of the project when you get to the sides to stitch them up because they're going to be shorter. Depending on the zipper application technique, you might run into issues with installing zipper tabs or not having zipper tabs. You might end up with a gap. It might, it's going to mess with you because the fabrics don't reach each other. In other words, the exterior panels and the lining panels do not reach the same place to sew them and kind of intersect, okay? So I don't start off with smaller panels. Instead, I use a larger seam allowance when I'm stitching up the bag, right? If you're familiar with zipper pouches, you know that we usually have the exterior panels to one side, pretty sides touching, and then the lining panels on another side, pretty sides touching. Well, when I'm stitching all the way around, you leave a hole so you can flip the whole thing over or inside out. When I'm on the lining side, I use a larger seam allowance. So if you're making a zippered pouch and the seam allowance in the pattern calls for 1/4 of an inch seam allowance on the exterior panels, I'm not going to use 1/4 of an inch seam allowance in the lining, right? Because then that would make them matching, and we've already established the fabric is going to pool on the inside. It's going to be a nightmare, and it won't look as neat as this, okay? Instead, you go a little bit bigger with the seam allowance in the lining. And by a little bit bigger, a lot of times my students are surprised to see that a little bit bigger means a lot a bit bigger, okay? So if the exterior seam allowance is 1/4 inch, I'll go as big as 3/4 of an inch, 5/8 of an inch for the lining seam allowance. And it might seem wild. I promise you, the first time you do it, you're like, oh no, it's not gonna sit inside the exterior of the bag. And it does, okay? But the trick is to not just start at the top. You gotta phase out. So if I'm coming from the exterior, pretend I'm sewing this way, and I've sewn all 1/4 inch seam allowance. When I cross over the side where the zipper end is, and I get to the lining fabric and I keep sewing, you got to come in a little bit, still at that 1/4 inch, and then I just kind of tweak it and go in big, big, pivot big, go big, pivot big, and then work your way back. So it's a little bit more of an advanced technique because you have to be able to adjust a seam allowance mid-project, okay? But doesn't it look a lot better? I mean, it's totally worth it, okay? So yeah, if you're in my foundation paper piecing quilt club, the video for this, I believe, goes up Saturday. And then y'all will be able to take your 6-inch blocks and turn them into these little pouches. And so we'll be going over that all step by step. For those of you that want to see a little bit more about what I'm talking about, remember to go to youtube.com and type in keywords. Remember, that's how you can find any videos that I've done. If you're looking for a free tutorial of mine, type in Crafty Gemini and follow it with some keywords on something that you're looking for. Quilt binding, okay? Zipper pouch, bag linings, and whatever videos I have done over the past 13 and a half years will show up right there for you to watch, okay? Awesome. Yay. Amanda says, I'm learning so much today. Thank you. You're welcome. All right. Great. Yeah, so Eunice says that she uses a zigzag around entire pattern pieces with fabric that ravels easily. So see, that's an example of using the zigzag stitch not for a decorative purpose and not necessarily for a construction purpose of a seam or for working with stretch knits, but for keeping the fabrics from raveling or fraying further, which a lot of times people do. If you buy a lot of yardage, say you buy 6 yards of something for a garment and it needs to be pre-washed, you don't have a serger, let's say, you can go and zigzag right on the raw edge, and that will keep the fabric, if it's a woven fabric, from fraying further in and still allow you to wash it, dry it, and then press it so that you can go in and cut the pieces that you need without losing a ton of that fabric to the fraying, okay? Oh, thank you, Melanie. I appreciate that. You're sweet. She says you have such wonderful communication skills. Your teaching is top notch. Thank you. I really, really appreciate that. I sure do try. All right, so that was the answer to that. So I don't suggest cutting the lining pieces smaller. Instead, I cut them to size, but I use a larger seam allowance. So they end up being smaller, and that way the lining fabrics can just sit in nicely like that, okay? So that's that. Now, the other question that Trelisa requested I answer is one that says, do you recommend using Wonder Tape or glue basting to keep the linings from shifting? So I'm not exactly sure what she was referring to in terms of the linings that shift, but let's show you something else. I have a bag here. This is my Sunday Tote, which actually I was going to get to after this question. I'll kind of just mix it in here. This was a project that we made last year as a part of my Bag Maker subscription box. So if you weren't in that subscription box program, this bag is not in any clubs. You would not have seen this yet, but it is a fabulous beginner sewing project. So if you're looking to get into bag making, I highly recommend my Sunday Tote, and I put it on sale only for the next 48 hours. So it's just a quick little flash sale to get some of you that kind of maybe want to try out bag making. You can save 10 bucks off the class. It comes with 9 step-by-step video lessons, okay? And look at the little bag. I use this. I have 2 of them. This one I've been using for 9 months. It does look a little bit older than this one, huh? And I took everything out. I swapped out to another one of my purses, but I'm going to pop this one in the washing machine today. Wash and dry, and everything will be fine. It stands up on its own. It's not huge. Cute project. Has a zipper. I use a metal zipper for a little bit of extra bling, okay? Super cute little handles. It's not a shoulder strap. It's not a crossbody. It's just like a little handbag purse, okay? But it covers a lot of the basic techniques that you need to know in order to make more complex handbags. So inside, it's fully lined, okay? You can see, I mean, and this is the one that I used for like 8 months. But you can see how the lining still sits in there. And then we have 2 patch pockets, one and one here. This is like a fabulous beginner project. It's all washable. And most of you probably have these supplies on hand. All you would need is fabric, a cotton fabric. I'm actually going to be making one with my soft vinyl that we have in the shop now. We carry the So Hungry Hippie vinyl. I think we only have rose gold and gold left, but I placed another order. So when we get more of these colors, we'll get them in. Tell me that this bag would not look amazing quilted and with this type of shiny, soft vinyl. Super pliable, super fun. So I'm going to be working on that. So it's super customizable as well. You know, you can play around with whatever fabrics you have. But cotton fabric, foam interfacing. I'm using the Bozo Interform, the sew-in. Look at the shape and the body that it has, even empty, stands up on its own. Okay? The handles are super pliable and soft. It's super simple. And all you need is one 14-inch zipper. It can be a number 3 craft zipper. It can be a 4.5 zipper like this metal one. It could be a number 5 or a number 4.5 plastic with nylon teeth handbag zipper. Super simple. Cotton fabric, foam interfacing, and a 14-inch zipper, and you could be making a bag. This was one of the first prototypes that I did, and I used just a craft zipper because it's what I had on hand, okay? So real simple, easy to put together, and again, 9 step-by-step video lessons and a 4-page PDF with printed text instructions, all right? But see how the linings on these, you can see down to the bottom, and it's flat. You don't see like that bubbling. If you've made bags, you know. It's hard to kind of explain it to people that haven't tried it yet and seen like, oh, I don't like the way that the bag lining lies inside the bag. You see that? I can see all the way down to the corners. It's not pooling anywhere, all right? This is, again, done by using a larger seam allowance like we just talked about in the small zipper pouches. It also applies in these bigger bags, okay? You use a larger seam allowance, and sometimes I go even larger of a seam allowance when it's a bigger bag. So I'm thinking Trelisa was asking about using Wonder Tape or glue basting to keep the linings from shifting when it's a big bag like this and the lining is fully separate, right? So if I pull this out, I could pull out this whole lining. So I'm thinking maybe she's asking about this. I wouldn't even bother to tape this down. If you use that larger seam allowance, you could then go in after you gave everything a press and look, just smooth it out into the corners so it is kind of copying the shape of the inside of the bag, and that's it. Super smooth. You can't even tell that there's a pocket here because I use the same fabric, right? But then you have two little patch pockets here, and it's so easy, straightforward. And I think, look at that lining. It looks so good. There's no pooling in there. So that same technique that I just walked y'all through, I use for both little bags and bigger bags. I wouldn't even bother to tape it, glue it. It's not going to stay put, especially once you start putting things in there. The key is more to get that lining to be positioned correctly from the beginning. Okay? All right. Mary's asking, do you sell the soft vinyl? We do. We're currently sold out of most colors, but we do have it in gold and rose gold. I think the seafoam is sold out. I was trying to see if I had the sample right around here, but we had like silver. We're going to be restocking them though. I don't have the gold here, but it's gold, a silver, some other kind of more rainbowy colors like that pink nebula that I showed you there. Just head on over to craftygemini.com/shop and you'll see it posted. Under all products or under fabric, you'll see them. And the ones that we have in stock will say that they're in stock, so you can check them out there. Thank you, Glenda. She says, I highly recommend purchasing. Yes, this was a part of the June, July, and August bag maker subscription box that we did last year. And when you go to the site, if you want to check out the bag class that I'm talking about, it's $10 off. It's called my Sunday Tote bag. And if you look through the gallery of the product page, you'll see several other bags from students who made it last year, and I put their pictures in there because I think it always helps to see it made up in a few different fabrics, and that way you can see what other students did and what they, the fabrics that they selected, you know, depending on the vibe of the purse that you want to carry out, okay? So there is no coupon code for it. It's just set for $10 off. So the sale price is already listed. It's down from $37. The sale price is $27. You get unlimited access. You get a 4-page PDF, and I have it here printed. So you get the supply list, all the step-by-step instructions. These are just designed to supplement the videos, and then there's 9 step-by-step videos. I walk you through cutting the fabric, putting everything together, installing the zipper for this technique. You saw how this zipper works, right? It's open here, okay? But it goes all the way past. And what that allows us to do is to open the bag fully. If I had a zipper that stopped right here, like a zippered pouch, and this would, let's say it was just like a bigger version of a zippered pouch. If this was pinched here, and I'm going to give you all this visual because you know I like to explain the whys. My zipper went from there to here. When I open my purse, that's what I would be able to get. Right? That's as much as I could open it. Now notice the difference. Just by switching up the zipper installation, I can open more here. This opens up and gives me over an inch more here. So it's not cinched up and pinched right there, okay? And then I have a couple of inches beyond the end of the zipper tape, which just hangs off and allows me to open it wide here. So I think, I mean, this is a preferred zipper installation technique for me when I'm making smaller purses. So it's still small in size, okay? But you can fit a ton because you can fully open it up. All right? So hopefully that makes sense and you know, a different type of zipper installation technique. Don't feel like you have to use a metal zipper. I know some of you out there are like, no way. You can use a craft zipper as well, or a handbag zipper, which is going to be a little bit wider. The teeth will be a little bit more substantial and you'll have a bigger zipper pull here, okay? But you have options. So check that out. The course is on sale just for 48 hours. So if you're catching us live, you're the first to find out about it. If you're watching this after the fact, sorry. The price is the regular price then. And you know what you can do is sign up for our email newsletter. So you'll be the first to know whenever we do offer little flash sales and new courses and clubs. Okay? All right. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank y'all so much for the feedback. Yay, Eunice says she just purchased the Sunday Tote. I can't wait to see what fabrics you choose. Awesome. Thank you so much. Okay, I appreciate everybody tuning in. Check out the core sale. Check out some other products. We do have that foam stabilizer in stock as well at craftygemini.com/shop. And I'll see y'all in the next video.